Hi everyone, today I'm going to build a new computer. This case is a Corsair 4000D. I chose this because it has a lot of fan mounts and is very spacious. The power supply is concealed on the bottom of the case. This modular Corsair power supply has a 10-year warranty. My old one, with a 5-year warranty, lasted more than 8 years. There are 4 screws that attach the power supply to the case. I chose Gigabyte's X870 Aurus Elite motherboard. I've used Gigabyte motherboards in all 8 computers I have built with no issues. I have a copper wire temporarily screwed into the power supply mounting screw for my ESD wrist strap. It gives you a better connection and the clip won't come off accidentally. This prevents static electricity from zapping any components. The back of the motherboard has metal reinforced brackets for the CPU cooling mounts and for the graphics card socket. This board has tons of features and connectors and can be upgraded to 256 gigs of RAM down the road. There is a central pin on the case that the motherboard seats into. There are 8 screws and washers to screw into the motherboard. Investing in a great motherboard can help future-proof your computer. The back panel is loaded with USB 3 and USB 4 sockets. I chose the AMD Ryzen 7900 processor because it runs a lot cooler than the 7900X. For now, I'll be using the stock cooler to get some temperature readings. I will eventually install a liquid cooler. I removed the plastic cover from the CPU socket clamp. I don't trust it to pop off on its own when it's clamped down. I'm inspecting the surface of the CPU socket to make sure there is no damage from manufacture and shipping. These AM5 chips don't have pins on the back of them. Notice the notches on the chip and a triangle in the upper left corner. Line those up with the alignment key and triangle on the socket. I will add the CPU cooler later so it isn't an obstacle during assembly. I've only used G.SKILL RAM in the last 17 years and have never had any problems. These are 32 GB sticks of DDR5 RAM. The RAM also has a notch in it to orient it correctly in the socket. I'm using just 2 sticks, so I have to put them in sockets A2 and B2 on this motherboard. Push down gently till you hear a click on both sides of the RAM. Then you know it's properly seated. I put the RAM in before the CPU fan just because it's easier to show what's going on. Samsung makes great SSD drives. This is my first time using the M2 style SSD. Peel off the film on the SSD drive heatsink cushion, and then the film on the cushion on the motherboard. I don't love this SSD M2 socket design. I lift up on it to make sure it was locked. I insert the SSD heatsink, which has a prong you insert and then push down on the other end. Then secure with the easy release latch. The stock thermal paste is just kind of stippled on the bottom of the heatsink. I installed this with stock thermal paste and heatsink to get a base CPU temperature reading. I'll install a liquid cooler later using Arctic MX6 paste. The temps so far are hovering around 44 degrees Celsius or 111 degrees Fahrenheit at idle. The room ambient temperature is about 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. When you clamp down the lever, it always makes me a little nervous with how much force you need to apply to crank it down. That's not going anywhere. Plug the 4-pin CPU fan cable into the socket labeled CPU fan. There are 5 system case fan sockets. Here are 3 of them. For now, there's one case fan in the front sucking in cool air, and one in the back blowing out hot air. There's only one way to insert these connectors. These 3-pin connectors fit in the 4-pin socket and work just fine. I think the 4-pin style is for the RGB lighted fans. The 24-pin power connector for the motherboard can only be inserted the correct way. I promise, I only tried inserting it the wrong way for the purpose of this video. On this Corsair power supply and Gigabyte motherboard, there are 2 2x4 pin connectors for the CPU, just in case you want to overclock or you need extra voltage. Don't use the PCIe cables, use the CPU cables. These were not as easy as it looks to insert in this tight space. They can also only be inserted one way. Inserting the F audio can also be tricky. This USB header for the case plugs into this 90-degree socket. This is the USB 4 connector for the case. Now for everyone's favorite part, plugging in the little individual pins and double pin connectors into the front panel connector. It's tight, and you can't see what you're doing with your hand in the way. Well, Gigabyte has this ingenious G connector to make this easier. You plug into the G connector first, and then that easily pushes into the motherboard connector. Make sure you plug in the positive and negative pins in the correct ports. This is where the PCIe Express X16 will go. I'm double checking all the connectors here. I'm also making sure there's no screws laying around. And now, the moment of truth. On my first boot, I panicked a little bit because there was no post screen, and there was a 15 error code on the motherboard. And this means bad RAM, or that it's inserted incorrectly. The RAM was fine, and with a quick search I determined that the system had to analyze the RAM, and it might take a few minutes on the first boot. That's exactly what happened, and it took about 2 minutes to post for the first boot. Then all was well. At this prompt I pressed Y. I'm installing Windows 10 from a flash drive. This is the post screen for the Gigabyte motherboard. It worked! Now that everything worked, I'll install my XFX Radeon RX 8... XX... That is a tongue twister. XFX Radeon RX 580 graphics card. This is the PCI Express 5.0 X16 slot. I inserted my graphics card into this socket and pressed down firmly. The latch will pop up on its own, locking the card into place. I had to remove 2 slots from the back of my case to insert the graphics card. Now I'll tighten down the hand screws to secure it into place. Then I'll plug in the PCIe connector. I have an older SSD I wanted to add to my computer for extra storage as well. I removed the bracket and screwed my Samsung SSD into it. The bracket hinges into place and is secured with a hand screw. These are the SATA ports this SSD drive will plug into. Thanks for watching.